On this episode, we'll be tackling the question, how do you put together a great interview for an author? With our special guest, Cameron Finch. Cam has worked with the editorial and marketing teams of various presses and literary journals, including Dzanc Books, Rizzoli New York, Archipelago Books, Hunger Mountain, and Midwestern Gothic. Cam holds an MFA in Writing and Publishing from Vermont College of Fine Arts and a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Additionally, Cam is a cross genre writer whose prose, poetry, and interviews with authors have appeared in the Adroit Journal, Craft, Electric Literature, Entropy, Glass, Michigan Quarterly Review, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining me, Cam. I'm so excited to hear about specifically that experience with author interviews. So I guess let's jump right into it. How do you put together a great interview for an author? On this episode, we'll be tackling the question, how do you put together a great interview for an author? With our special guest, Cameron Finch. Cam has worked with the editorial and marketing teams of various presses and literary journals, including Dzanc Books, Rizzoli New York, Archipelago Books, Hunger Mountain, and Midwestern Gothic. Cam holds an MFA in Writing and Publishing from Vermont College of Fine Arts and a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Additionally, Cam is a cross genre writer whose prose, poetry, and interviews with authors have appeared in the Adroit Journal, Craft, Electric Literature, Entropy, Glass, Michigan Quarterly Review, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining me, Cam. I'm so excited to hear about specifically that experience with author interviews. So I guess let's jump right into it. How do you put together a great interview for an author?
Thanks, Sayla. Thanks for having me. And also, thank you for this very meta interview, the most meta interview that I've ever had about interviews. So that's
Absolutely.
um, yeah, I guess today I really want to talk about just giving folks an idea of if you have never gone into an interview, uh, creating an interview for an author before, kind of where to begin. But before I get into that, sharing some examples and sort of how I approach the interview process, I just wanted to say a few plugs for interviews themselves and why I think that they are an underrated literal genre of their own of writing. I think that they for people who love close reading books, it personally is a very satisfying endeavor because you get to read books not for specifically like what happens or to be entertained, but to like understand how things are put together. And I always read when I'm reading a book for an interview, I read with a notebook, and it's like I'm reading for patterns, for repeating words, for I'm looking for objects that might be significant or sentences that are foreboding, or I don't really know what I'm looking for, and that's really exciting. It's almost like putting together like a piece of like pieces of the puzzle. You're like quarantining pieces that might be important later on as you go forward in the puzzle, but the puzzle won't actually be complete until you talk to the writer themselves. And uh, yeah, I think that it's also a really great promotional tool if you want to support writers who you adore and are important, and you want to talk to writers who you love, who you otherwise may never meet in person. This is a way to like directly write to their email or get on a phone call with them and ask the questions that are burning inside you from a professional standpoint, of course, but by submitting interviews to be published online or in print, you're actually doing a great service to those writers by giving them the attention and like honor of your attention. So write interviews is the message. As far as putting together an interview, I kind of mentioned this before, but I do read the entire book very thoroughly, and I do I take notes again on like anything that I deem important, small or large, and I don't really know what will be important, but it is a different kind of reading than just for sheer pleasure, even though it is a very pleasurable experience. Um, I also read other interviews or podcasts with the author to make sure I'm not repeating questions that the author has already been asked by somebody else. Um, and in some cases, I can actually then build off a response that was first asked in a different interview. So sometimes in my interviews, I'll refer or like link to an interview that the author did with a different publication and interviewer and say, you mentioned this in your interview on, X and Y review. And, here's the quote from that. And I see how that relates to this particular essay in your book. Can you speak more about, why, why you decided to write a book of essays instead of a memoir? Or like, you can kind of make references to other conversations that they've had. And that also shows that you've done your research. Um, I uh, I also um, I also don't go into a question knowing the answer. And I think this is just my rule of thumb because I find that more interesting to not know the answer. I'm just a question asker in general in my entire life. But if I know the answer already, I don't ask it. And that's not because it's not a valid question, but because the questions that I like to ask are I always want to create openings for authors to expand the conversation into directions that I don't know where they're going. Um, so I'll kind of lead into that by going over some of the questions that I have asked, and I do have a particular structure that I use with interviews where I can if I'm writing a bunch of interviews at a time, I can kind of use the same framework and ask variations of those questions depending on the piece. So you don't always have to feel like you're starting from scratch on every interview, but you should customize it, absolutely. Uh, the general framework is very much like forming for me for is like forming an essay or even like a beginning, middle, and end of a story. So at the beginning, I start a little bit more big picture with the structure of the book project itself. If it's linked stories or essays or poems, I think more about like how was there a particular poem that kind of inspired the project or that you started with? Did you know from the beginning what the entire project will be? How did it evolve? What why did you begin writing this? Sort of from a more creation standpoint. And then I hone in on more kind of finer details. I focus the attention to character idiosyncrasies or patterns that I'm noticing, identities that the author is writing from or into, thinking about asking questions of the author of like their audience and who they're trying to impact through the writing of this book. Philosophies often come into my questions. Just very interested in like the why, and I also love to lean into like fascinations and obsessions of authors. I would actually hope that somebody creates like a podcast one day that is just about like author obsessions. I think that would be really fun. But so for example, I was reading a book that was a novel, and every chapter they were linked stories, and many of them were investigating kind of the possibility of space travel, um, or kind of the beyond of Earth. And uh, so my question then to that author was, you know, what fascinates you about space, about space travel and about the stars, and uh, so I mean that's always kind of a good starting point. It's um, I think it's also really fun to hear, obviously we don't write in vacuums. Many of us are readers, and consume other types of media that influence our interests, that kind of changes it or plays um, into how we create images, what our settings look like, and so asking questions about what other books or media that their book is in conversation with or were influential to the thinking and conception of that book, is just a really fun way. Like if you love that author, you want to know what they're reading, and it's just tapping into like their library of like their own personal library, which is rad. um, I also wanted to share a pro tip is to read the author's acknowledgments. I will usually do this actually before I read the book, because um, authors will sometimes add information in there about certain kind of research that they did or the context that they found themselves in during the writing of the book. Maybe a relative passed away during that writing of the book, or a major event such as the pandemic happened. Maybe they found themselves really interested um, in studying a particular kind of technology in a part of the world, and all of that information that is specifically about the author, you can then go into the book with that knowledge and start making connections of why they are writing their characters in this way, and then ask them about it. Uh, let's see, there are a couple other ones that I just wanted to mention. Uh, yeah, I mentioned like the recurring words. And this is a good one if you ever get stuck or that you want to ask more questions, but you're not quite sure how to get there. Sometimes that does happen where I have my main question, but I never want to ask just one-liners. I use the questions as opportunities to bring in my own analysis or close reading, and almost like play back some of their language, to to give as example, and for the for question, for as proof for the question, and again also by giving some more of that language from the book itself, it serves as an advertisement for readers that, hey, this book is awesome. Look at this incredible language. Go read this book now. But so I go with recurring words. I think, again, with the obsessions, when we, as writers, are preoccupied with something or just love the particular like mouth feel of a word, we use it a lot.
Yeah.
And that's something to pay attention to. So I'll give an example. A few years ago, I had read the book, a novel by the author Sequoia Nagamatsu. Incredible book, How Far We Go in the Dark. And I noticed that the word possibility was showing up in every single chapter. This was also a book that came out in 2021, so we were just through like the first dark year of COVID. And that book, I think personally was real. I felt that was very relatable. I was looking for possibility. So that's why that stood out to me. And I'll just read to you my question that I gave, just so you get an example of how I construct my questions.
Yeah,
So
please.
this was the very last question in the series of the interview, and I put it there because it felt like the conclusion. Um, so it says, despite the darkness in your novel, there's a recurring word that appears in almost every chapter, a word that sparks lightness and hope for our individual and collective futures: possibility. And then I go on to explain briefly in my own words about ways that the word possibility is used throughout the book. So this is again just giving a little summary to readers who have not yet read the book, how this word is being used. So I say possibility is another planetary system. Possibility is a mural that can outlast a human's lifetime. Possibility is a memory programmed into the wiring of a robo-dog. And then I end the question by saying, what gives you a sense of possibility these days? And so there I am taking this word, this concept, this theme that has been perpetuated throughout the novel, and I'm giving that same word now over to the author to bring this possibility outside of the novel and into space. And yeah, so I mean that is just another example of how to bring the questions always back to yeah, creating those openings for authors. um
Yeah. I mean, I
yeah.
really love the way that you started this off by describing interviews as like their own genre, and I think that really speaks to that because it's not as I think it sounds like a simple concept to put together an interview, but it's clearly just so reciprocal and there's such a symbiotic nature to it, the way you talk about it, and the way that you construct an interview. So you can kind of see obviously an author puts a lot of work into producing a book and putting all the words on the page and editing and sharing it with people and really kind of bearing their soul in that way. But on the flip side, with these interviews, especially as you're describing this process, it's very reciprocal because you're consuming the work that this author has put out. But not only that, now you are crafting something for them in that same medium. So um, it's almost closer to a conversation, it sounds like, than just, a radio interview, let's say. So I just wanted to comment on that because I thought that was such a beautiful sentiment, and it's clear how much joy is in it for you. So I'm excited to see what um, comes from you next, what kind of interviews you bring to the world next. So um, thank you also, Cam, for coming on and talking about this with us. Before we say goodbye to our guest, I'm happy to say that this podcast is brought to you by Atmosphere Press, the only publisher that puts rewarding and meaningful author experiences above all else. Founded in 2015 by an author and PhD in literature and devoted to serving authors through editorial, design, publication, and promotion, Atmosphere has sold tens of thousands of copies of our authors' books across 6 continents. Visit atmospherepress.com to sign up for Atmosphere's newsletter, The Launchpad, and to learn more about submission opportunities, event news, and book, publicity, and writing residency giveaways. But I also want to ask you, where should our listeners go to learn more about you and also to learn more about your interviews?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Um, I really could talk about interviews all day and I want more, I would love more people to do it. It's so much fun to read. And honestly, like once you start asking questions, I think you start to uh, read questions with the same amount of interest that you read the answers. So yes, I would love people to ask me questions. You can find me on my website, which is the letters Finch.com. And on there, you can read about me. You can read some of my work, both creative and then also my interviews, which also are creative. Um, and then my email address is on there too. And please feel free to reach out if you have a book that you're interested in being interviewed on, or you're just starting out, or want a buddy in interviewing authors. So, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you also to all the listeners for tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Right Atmosphere, the Advice for Writers podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share our podcast with the writers in your life. And if you're ready to take the next step in your publishing journey, visit atmospherepress.com to submit your manuscript for publication consideration or to learn more about writing and what it is that we do. I'm Hala. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.